Lucas had always considered himself an ordinary man. At 28 years old, he lived a quiet life in the small town of Cedarwood, working as a mechanic in his late father's garage. His days were predictable, fixing cars, chatting with the regular customers, and spending evenings in his modest apartment, lost in the pages of adventure novels. Cedarwood was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, and nothing ever really changed. So when Lucas received a letter from a law firm in New York, it was as if a stone had been thrown into the still waters of his life. The letter, with its embossed gold seal, stood out like a sore thumb among the usual bills and advertisements. Lucas opened it with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, his hands slightly trembling. The contents were even more surprising than the letter itself. He had inherited a vast fortune from a man named Edward Branson, a name he had never heard before. The letter explained that Branson was a distant relative, though the details were vague. The amount was staggering, enough to change his life forever. Lucas couldn't believe it. Why him? Why now? The letter provided no answers, only instructions to meet with the firm's attorney, a Mr. Sullivan, to discuss the details. Lucas's mind raced with questions. What had led this stranger to leave him such a large sum of money? Was it a mistake? Or worse, a scam? Despite his reservations, Lucas felt an undeniable pull to uncover the truth. He decided to make the trip to New York and find out more about this mysterious benefactor. The journey to New York was both thrilling and nerve-wracking. As Lucas sat on the train, watching the landscape change from the rural outskirts of Cedarwood to the towering skyline of Manhattan, he couldn't help but feel a sense of adventure, like the characters in the novels he loved so much. But there was also a gnawing uncertainty. The life he had known was already starting to slip away, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what lay ahead. When Lucas arrived at the law firm, he was greeted by Mr. Sullivan, a polished man in his mid-50s with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. Sullivan wasted no time in getting to the point. He confirmed that Edward Branson was indeed a distant relative, a great uncle on his mother's side, and that Lucas was the sole heir to his vast estate. Sullivan handed Lucas a thick envelope filled with documents and keys, but what caught Lucas's attention was an old, leather-bound diary. "This belonged to Mr. Branson," Sullivan said, his tone more serious than before. "He instructed that it be given to you along with the inheritance. He was very particular about it." Lucas accepted the diary with a sense of reverence, its worn cover and yellowed pages hinting at the life it contained within. He thanked Sullivan and left the office, his thoughts now completely consumed by this new mystery. Who was Edward Branson, and why had he chosen Lucas to inherit his fortune? Back in his apartment, Lucas sat at his small kitchen table, the diary in front of him. The keys to Branson's estate and the documents lay untouched to the side. Lucas hesitated, his fingers hovering over the diary's cover. What secrets did it hold? Taking a deep breath, he opened it to the first page. The neat handwriting, though faded with time, was still legible. The diary began innocuously enough, Branson writing about his daily life, business dealings, and thoughts. But as Lucas read on, the tone darkened. Branson wrote of ruthless decisions, of manipulating people and situations to his advantage, and of wealth accumulated through questionable means. It became clear that Branson had not been an honorable man. One particular entry stood out to Lucas. It described how Branson had ruined a small family business to secure a lucrative deal, leaving the family destitute. The name of the family was familiar to Lucas. It was the same family his mother had often spoken of with a mix of sadness and anger. They were relatives, though distant, and the story had always been a source of pain for her. Lucas felt a cold chill run down his spine. This was not the inheritance he had imagined. The money that could change his life had been tainted by the sufferer. He couldn't keep it, not without doing something to make amends. As the days passed, Lucas found himself obsessing over the diary. Each entry revealed more of Branson's misdeeds, people whose lives he had destroyed, fortunes amassed at the expense of others. The more Lucas read, the more determined he became. He couldn't undo the past, but he could try to set things right. He decided that he would find those who had been wronged by Branson and anonymously repay them, using the fortune he had in her. This decision weighed heavily on him, but it also gave him a sense of purpose he had never felt before. The quiet mechanic from Cedarwood was gone, replaced by a man on a mission. He would use the money to balance the scales, to bring some measure of justice to those who had suffered. But Lucas knew this wouldn't be easy. He was stepping into a world of secrets and shadows, where the truth was often hidden and the past was never truly buried. As he closed the diary and looked out at the bustling city below, Lucas realized that this was only the beginning of a journey that would change him and the lives of others forever. Lucas sat in his small living room, the worn diary open on his lap, as the afternoon sunlight filtered through the blinds. The words of Edward Branson seemed to leap off the page, pulling him deeper into the mind of a man he had never met. Yet with each entry he read, Lucas felt as though he was coming to know Branson intimately, his thoughts, his ambitions, and his regrets. The diary took Lucas back to the early days of Branson's life. Through Branson's own words, Lucas saw the young man he once was, ambitious, intelligent, but also ruthless. Branson wrote about the first time he realized the power of money, how it could bend people to his will. He recounted the thrill of his early successes, deals made with a handshake that left his competitors scrambling. But as Lucas continued reading, the tone of the entries changed. The once confident young man began to show signs of doubt and guilt. Branson described the night he met a man named Samuel, a small business owner with a thriving shop in the heart of Cedarwood. Samuel was kind, well-respected, and had built his business from the ground up. But Branson saw an opportunity. He manipulated a deal that led to Samuel's financial ruin, acquiring the shop for a fraction of its worth. Samuel, left with nothing, eventually left Cedarwood, his family struggling to survive. Lucas's heart ached as he read Branson's recollections of this event. The name Samuel was one Lucas had heard before. His mother had spoken of a Mr. Samuel Hawthorne, a man who had once been a close friend of the family. Lucas remembered her telling him how Hawthorne had to leave town under mysterious circumstances, never to be heard from again. Now, Lucas understood why. Branson's actions had destroyed the Hawthorne family, and Samuel had been forced to abandon everything he had worked for. As Lucas continued to read, he found more stories like Samuel's, families torn apart, lives shattered, all because of Branson's relentless pursuit of wealth. The more he learned, the more Lucas was consumed by an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He couldn't simply walk away from this. The money he had inherited was stained with the suffering of others, and Lucas knew he had to do something about it. In the days that followed, Lucas found himself lost in thought, his mind a battleground of conflicting emotions. He would sit in the garage pretending to work on a car, but his thoughts would always drift back to the diary. Could he really make amends for the wrongs Branson had done? Was it even possible to atone for such sins? These questions haunted him, pushing him to the brink of despair. One evening, as Lucas walked through Cedarwood's quiet streets, he noticed a small, run-down house near the edge of town. An elderly woman was sitting on the porch knitting quietly. Something about her seemed familiar. Lucas hesitated, then approached her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly. "Are you Mrs. Hawthorne?" The woman looked up, her eyes sharp despite her age. "Yes, I am. Do I know you, young man?" "I don't think so," Lucas replied, sitting on the porch steps. "But I know of your family. My name is Lucas. My mother used to talk about your husband, Samuel." At the mention of her husband's name, Mrs. Hawthorne's expression softened and she sighed deeply. "Samuel was a good man," she said quietly, "but life wasn't kind to him." Lucas felt a pang of guilt as he listened to her speak. He wanted to tell her everything, to explain how he had come to know about what had happened to Samuel, about the diary, and about Branson's role in it all, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Not yet. Instead, Lucas spent the evening with Mrs. Hawthorne, listening to her stories about the past, about the life she had shared with Samuel before everything fell apart. The more he listened, the more determined he became. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could do something to help. Over the next few weeks, Lucas began to spend more time with the people of Cedarwood, especially those who had been affected by Branson's actions. He visited Mrs. Hawthorne regularly, helping her with small chores around the house and listening to her stories. He also sought out others, finding subtle ways to get to know them without revealing too much about his own connection to Branson. One day, Lucas met Thomas, a middle-aged man who ran a struggling hardware store on the edge of town. Thomas was kind and generous, always willing to lend a hand to those in need, even though his own business was barely staying afloat. As they talked, Lucas learned that Thomas's father had once owned a similar store in the heart of Cedarwood, a store that had been bought out by Branson, forcing the family to relocate and start over. Thomas spoke with a quiet resignation about his father's fate, not knowing that the man he was talking to held the key to understanding why it had happened. Lucas's heart ached as he listened, and he found himself growing more and more attached to these people who had been wronged by Branson's greed. But with each new relationship, Lucas's inner turmoil deepened. He couldn't bring himself to tell them the truth about Branson, nor could he reveal his plans to anonymously repay them. The more he connected with these people, the more he realized how much they had suffered and how much they deserved to know the truth. Yet he feared that revealing it would only cause more pain. Despite his growing attachment to the people of Cedarwood, Lucas knew that he couldn't stay silent forever. He had to find a way to make things right, even if it meant sacrificing his own peace of mind. The idea of donating the money anonymously began to take root in his mind, but he struggled with the thought of whether it would be enough. Would it truly bring the closure these people deserved? Or was it just an easy way out for him? As Lucas continued to wrestle with these questions, he found himself growing more distant from the life he had known. The garage, once his sanctuary, now felt like a prison, and the simple pleasures that had once brought him comfort no longer held the same appeal. He was a man divided, caught between the need to do what was right and the fear of the consequences. In the end, Lucas knew that there was no turning back. He had been given a responsibility that he couldn't ignore, and the lives of those around him were now intertwined with his own in ways he had never imagined. The journey he had started was far from over, and the choices he made in the coming days would determine not only his future, but the futures of those who had suffered in silence for far too long. Lucas found himself increasingly trapped in a web of internal and external conflicts. The weight of Edward Branson's secrets bore down on him, each revelation in the diary a new burden to carry. He couldn't shake the guilt that had settled in his chest, nor could he ignore the growing pressure from those around him who had heard about his sudden windfall. Cedarwood was a small town and news traveled fast. Despite his attempts to keep the inheritance quiet, word had leaked out and people began to treat him differently. Friends who had once been content with a simple life now seemed eager to remind Lucas of all the things money could buy. They suggested investments, new ventures, or extravagant purchases, none of which sat well with Lucas. He could see the subtle shift in their eyes, the way their conversations began to revolve around wealth and opportunity. It made him uncomfortable, as if they were expecting him to transform into someone he wasn't. Internally, Lucas was torn between the temptation to use the money for himself and the moral obligation he felt to make amends for Branson's actions. He could easily buy a new car, fix up his apartment, or even leave Cedarwood behind for a fresh start elsewhere. But every time these thoughts crossed his mind, the faces of those Branson had hurt would surface, reminding him of the responsibility he now carried. The diary had become a constant presence in his life, each page a reminder of the darkness that had tainted the fortune he had inherited. As he read more, Lucas began to see just how deep the roots of Branson's corruption went. It wasn't just Samuel Hawthorne or Thomas's family. There were others, many others, whose lives had been shattered by Branson's greed. The more Lucas uncovered, the more isolated he felt. He couldn't share this burden with anyone, not even those who had become close to him. The secrets weighed heavily on his conscience and the strain began to show. One evening, after another frustrating day at the garage, Lucas sat alone in his apartment staring at the diary. He had avoided opening it for days, hoping that somehow by ignoring it, the weight of its contents would lessen. But he knew that wasn't the case. The longer he delayed, the more the conflict within him grew. He was caught between two worlds, the simple life he had known and the complex moral labyrinth Brands. The people around him, those who looked at him with envy or hope, didn't understand the turmoil he was in. They saw only the potential for wealth and change, not the guilt and responsibility that came with it. Lucas knew he had to make a decision, and soon. He couldn't continue living in this state of paralysis, torn between doing what was right and succumbing to the pressures around him. But what was right? Was it enough to simply keep the money and live quietly, hoping that his presence in Cedarwood would somehow make up for Branson's sins? Or did he owe it to those who had suffered to use the money in a way that could bring them some semblance of justice? The conflict gnawed at him night and day. Lucas found himself withdrawing from those who tried to get close to him, unsure of whom he could trust. The fear of being influenced by others, or of making a wrong choice, paralyzed him. He was a man caught in a storm of emotions with no clear path forward. The turning point came on a cold, clear morning in Cedarwood. Lucas had been awake all night, wrestling with his conscience, when he made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. He couldn't keep the money, not all of it at least. Branson's fortune wasn't his to enjoy. It was a burden that needed to be lifted, not just from his own shoulders, but from the town that had suffered under Branson's shadow. Lucas resolved to start donating the money anonymously, targeting the families and individuals who had been directly harmed by Branson's ruthless business practices. He would do it quietly, without fanfare, hoping to bring some measure of peace to those who had lost so much. The process was slow and methodical. Lucas carefully studied Branson's diary, identifying the people who had been wronged and the specific ways in which their lives had been destroyed. He began to transfer money anonymously to these individuals, often in the form of anonymous bank deposits or payments to cover outstanding debts. It wasn't about making them rich. It was about restoring some of what had been taken from them. At first, it seemed to work. The recipients were stunned by their sudden change in fortune, grateful for the unexpected help without knowing its source. Lucas felt a sense of relief, as if a small part of the burden he carried was beginning to lift. But as he continued, the process became more complicated. One of the recipients, a man named David, had been particularly vocal about his sudden windfall. David, who had been on the brink of losing his home, suddenly found his mortgage paid off in full. He couldn't stop talking about it, sharing his good fortune with anyone who would listen. His enthusiasm, however, turned into curiosity and then suspicion. He began to wonder who would do such a thing and why. David's curiosity led him to Star. He asked around town, probing for any clues that might reveal the identity of his benefactor. Lucas watched with growing anxiety as David's questions began to circle closer to the truth. The man was persistent, and Lucas knew it was only a matter of time before David connected the dots. The situation reached a critical point one evening when David approached Lucas directly. The two had known each other for years, though never particularly well. Now there was a strange intensity in David's eyes, a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. "Lucas," David said, cornering him outside the garage, "I need to ask you something. I've been thinking a lot about this money that came my way, and I can't shake the feeling that you know something about it. Am I right?" Lucas's heart raced. He hadn't prepared for this confrontation, hadn't anticipated just how close David would get to uncovering the truth. For a moment he considered denying everything, playing dumb and hoping that David would drop it. But the look in David's eyes told him that wouldn't work. Caught off guard, Lucas mumbled something vague, trying to deflect the question. But David wasn't satisfied. He pressed harder and Lucas realized he was running out of options. The anonymity he had relied on was slipping away, and with it, the safety of those he had tried to help. In that moment, Lucas knew he had to make a decision. He could either come clean, risking everything, or find a way to throw David off the trail. The pressure was building, and the consequences of his actions were becoming all too real. Lucas felt the walls closing in around him. David's relentless questioning had brought the pressure to a boiling point. The fear of being exposed gnawed at him day and night, eroding his resolve. He could no longer sleep peacefully, haunted by the thought that his secret might be uncovered, and with it the delicate balance he had tried to maintain would come crashing down. One evening, unable to bear the tension any longer, Lucas made a decision. He needed to confront David, to explain the situation before it spiraled further out of control. He invited David to meet him at a quiet spot just outside of town, a place where they could talk without fear of being overheard. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the landscape, Lucas waited anxiously for David to arrive. The air was thick with anticipation, every sound amplified by the silence around him. When David finally appeared, Lucas could see the questions burning in his eyes. "Lucas," David began, his voice tinged with both frustration and concern, "I've been trying to figure out what's going on. You've been acting strange lately, and this money, it's not normal. I need to know the truth." Lucas took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he knew would be the hardest conversation of his life. "David," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "you're right. There's something you need to know, but it's not what you think." He then began to explain, carefully and methodically, how he had come into the money, how it was tied to the dark legacy of Edward Branson, and how he had tried to use it to make amends for the wrongs Branson had committed. As he spoke, he watched David's expression shift from confusion to shock and finally to a deep, contemplative silence. "I didn't want anyone to know," Lucas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought that by keeping it anonymous I could help without causing more harm. But I see now that maybe I've made things worse." David was quiet for a long time, his mind clearly racing as he processed everything Lucas had told him. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that Lucas hadn't heard before. "Lucas," David said slowly, "I get why you did it and I appreciate the help more than you know. But keeping it a secret like this, it's dangerous. People will start asking questions, and if they find out the truth, it could turn ugly. You need to think about what's best for everyone involved." Lucas nodded, knowing that David was right. The time for secrets was over. He needed to find a way to come clean, to reveal the truth without causing more harm. But how? The thought of facing the people of Cedarwood, of explaining his connection to Branson and the tainted money, filled him with dread. As they stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on them, David offered a suggestion. "Maybe there's a way to do this without causing too much damage," he said. "We could start by letting people know about the money, but not all at once. We could ease them into it, give them time to understand why you did what you did." Lucas considered this, the idea offering a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had enveloped him. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was better than the alternative, better than waiting for the truth to explode in his face. They spent the next few hours discussing how to proceed, mapping out a plan that would allow Lucas to slowly reveal the truth while minimizing the potential fallout. It was a delicate balance, one that required careful thought and execution. But Lucas felt a sense of relief knowing that he wasn't facing this alone. The next few weeks were some of the most challenging of Lucas's life. He began to slowly introduce the idea to the people of Cedarwood that the money some of them had received wasn't a random stroke of luck, but rather part of a deliberate effort to make amends for past wrongs. He didn't reveal everything at once, instead choosing to share parts of the story as he grew more comfortable with the process. To his surprise, the people of Cedarwood reacted with compassion and understanding. They appreciated Lucas's honesty and his desire to do the right thing, even if it had come after a period of secrecy. Many of them had suspected that there was more to the story but had chosen not to press too hard, out of respect for Lucas's privacy. As word spread, Lucas found himself overwhelmed by the support he received. People began to approach him not with anger or resentment, but with gratitude and kindness. They understood that he had been placed in an impossible situation and had done his best to navigate it with integrity. With David's help, Lucas was able to set up a foundation dedicated to helping those in Cedarwood who had been affected by Branson's actions. The foundation became a way for Lucas to channel the remaining funds into projects and causes that would benefit the community, ensuring that Branson's legacy would be transformed from one of greed and destruction to one of healing and restitution. In the end, Lucas's journey had come full circle. He had started as an ordinary man, thrust into an extraordinary situation, and had emerged from it with a deeper understanding of himself and the world around him. He had faced his fears, made difficult choices, and in doing so, had found a way to honor both his own conscience and the people he cared about. As the foundation grew and the town began to heal, Lucas felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. The burden of Branson's legacy had been lifted, and in its place Lucas found a new purpose, a purpose rooted in compassion, community, and the quiet strength that comes from doing what is right, even when it's difficult. As he stood on the steps of the foundation's new building, looking out over the town that had become his home, Lucas knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges, but he also knew that he wasn't facing it alone. The people of Cedarwood had become his family, and together they would continue to rebuild one step at a time. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Lucas's story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and leave your thoughts in the comments below.